Most of Theravada Buddhism is presented dualistically. So for even cessation, for example, the instruction would be, okay, James, I want you to take Nibbana as your object, as your meditative object. You know, what? Where in the direct, we're not talking about it in that kind of dualistic way. And so the most of the practices begin with a certain amount of me bringing some effort to the practice. I'm staying with this object intentionally. So I keep returning, and eventually it begins to stay on its own. And this is where the proactive effort shifts to receptive effort or receiving. And this is where it becomes the effortless effort you're talking about, where something is happening, but the practice is beginning to do you. And that's a shift that happens. And that's true of all practice. I mean, shikantaza, koan, same thing. We at first take it up, I have the koan mu. It's my koan. And after a while, there's just mu.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Stephen Snyder. Stephen is a Dharma teacher in the Zen Buddhist traditions of Soto and Rinzai, as well as in the Theravadan Buddhist tradition. He's the author of Demystifying Awakening, Buddha's Heart, Trust in Awakening, Liberating the Self, and is co-author of the book Practicing the Jhānas. You can find out about his teachings and retreats at awakeningdharma.org. Today, we discuss the gradual and direct paths to awakening and beyond. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Stephen Snyder. Stephen, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, James. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. So you have quite an interesting background. You've studied in lots of different lineages, and I was wondering if you could maybe give the audience a bit of an overview of that background, where it began,
Sure.
and where it led.
Sure. Yeah, I began meditating about 50 years ago. I started in the Zen tradition, and while maintaining that participation in the Zen tradition, I also began some study in the Theravadan tradition, eventually being authorized to teach by the Buddhist scholar and meditation master Paul Sayadaw from Myanmar. And I've continued to teach those practices I learned from him for the last 20 years. And then during the pandemic, the lockdown, I was able to fulfill a lifelong dream of mine, which was to complete my Zen studies. And I completed formal koan study with my teacher, and then completed what we call Zen Dharma transmission. So I'm a fully authorized teacher in the White Pluma Sangha, which is probably the largest group of Zen teachers in the world.
Great.
And I'll throw in one more thing. Sorry. I also did practice for about 15 years in the Western non-dual school Diamond approach, including doing their eight-year teacher training. I did not become a teacher, but I found the training to be very valuable to me.
Great. So you have a whole kind of range of practices here that you talk about rather than being fixed in one lineage. And I wonder if, before we delve into we're going to delve into the different traditions, different practices, but yeah, would you be able to kind of lay out the core practices that you teach people?
Sure. I generally want to start people with concentration meditation, which is how the Theravadan and the Zen school generally direct people. And this would be breath awareness practice called anapanasati, which means breath awareness meditation. And that's basically focusing on the breath in the region we call the anapana region between the nostrils and the upper lip. It's a very challenging location to focus on, but it really helps deepen meditative concentration and unify the mind. I also teach the Brahma Viharas, the heart practices, the ancient Buddhist heart practices. I think they're terribly important both for our maturing our relationships to different categories of beings, benefactors, friends, family members, challenging people, etc. And also we can contact the transcendent side of that as well. That can lead to deep absorption in the heart quality. And these are heart qualities of the absolute, the source. So it's not your and my heart qualities. It's not human emotions we're orienting to, but unconditioned heart qualities that are always present. Once people have a good handle on those two, then typically I suggest they do one of my awakening retreats, which is a combination of doing the Zen Shikantaza practice, just sitting meditation, and also the students who are interested, I guide in formal koan study, which is a many-year, multi-hundred koan journey. And I find that works really well with people. So we're working both the heart, the psychological material, from a spiritual perspective, and then also orienting toward the absolute and awakening.
Right, that's wonderful because I think you see different traditions sometimes land in either the direct approaches like the koans and the shikantaza just sitting, or the gradual approaches, and it seems to me that it doesn't need to be either or. You can do both.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And that's really a lot of my teaching. I tell people, if you want a traditional Theravadan or Zen teacher, I'm not the person for you. I'm more experimenting all the time. I try things with students and see what works. And so I begin to incorporate into my overall teaching when I'll do it with small groups or individuals and start testing to see, is this a viable approach or not? Is this helping? And so I'm always inventing. The students are sort of, and I don't mean I'm inventing practices. I'm inventing the sort of innovating the combinations, the different combinations. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, my background is as a scientist, so that kind of experimentation, resonates. But also a kind of respect for the reality of this terrain, rather than being locked into conceptual models of what you think it should be like. Just actually
Right.
working with this present moment, working with students, seeing what's alive, seeing what works. I like that pragmatism that you're bringing.
Well, I think we have to, because the practices really are timeless. Almost all the Buddhist practices predate the Buddha. Most have their roots in the yogic tradition, and even in the yogic tradition before there was writing. So these were oral traditions passed along for probably hundreds or thousands of years before they were even recorded. So the cool thing to me is that these rigorous practices are still incredibly relevant with our modern psychologies and consciousness. We still benefit greatly from the old practices.
Right. Yeah, and I think it was I was watching a video of yours. I think it was a talk you gave at Mountain Cloud Zen Center with Henry Schuckman, who's a previous podcast guest. And you were saying how you'd studied Zen, and then learning that the Buddha had studied these jhana practices. You kind of thought, well, I should probably try the thing the actual Buddha was doing, right? Which I thought was an interesting stance, and interesting that it predated the Buddha. These practices that he recommended.
Right. Yeah. And that was really my journey into Theravada, was that I'd heard a lot about what the Buddha said and all, and I became very intrigued with what did the Buddha actually practice and do. And like the jhana practice, I've been told by a couple of Buddhist scholars that it was, quote, his favorite practice. He would do it during the rains retreats each year. And in fact, it was his last practice he did before he died, at least it's recorded in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. So this stuff is very relevant. And again, he was deeply realized, and to think he was still engaging with these practices means there's still something to get. We don't conclude our work with these practices.
Yeah, I think someone was telling me, I think it was Daniel Ingram was saying that there in some of the suttas it says that his back pain and his body pain in old age, he would enter the jhanas for relief, from that physical pain. So which is kind of interesting that he's uprooted the kind of dukkha, but there can still be a preference for entering jhana to move beyond the mundane physical pain that we don't really ever escape, I guess.
Right. It has that possibility. Yeah.
Yeah. And so with the kind of Theravada tradition, there's this big emphasis on cessation, on this kind of blinking out of consciousness. And I came to this stuff through a kind of spontaneous awakening. So Zen has always kind of appealed more, because that I feel like actually might be good to share with you that, as a Zen teacher, I've always analogized what happened to me as something like approximating koan practice without realizing I was doing it, because I was ruminating on the possibility of going to hell with all of my kind of, as a teenager, all my effort kind of going into this concern. But I couldn't figure out a way to have blind faith. It seemed impossible. So my rational mind was kind of trying to solve this paradox. I need to have blind faith. I can't find it. And then, Kensho seemed to to happen as a result.
Right.
And I later on when I learned about Zen, yeah, I thought that seemed like something like koan practice. Does there seem to be an analogy there in your mind?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are, Dogen used the term the Genjo koan, the everyday koan. And to me, that's really what you're talking about, is people will have a life koan that presents, and you just get stuck with it. I wrote about that with my first awakening as well. I was reading a book on the sixth patriarch of Chan, Huining, and he was quoted a line from the Diamond Sutra: support the thought that is nowhere, or show me the thought that's nowhere produced, or something like that. I'm not saying it right, but it snagged me. The idea of a thought that couldn't be produced was like, just kind of wedged in my brain in a way that I couldn't get out of. So that ended up leading to eventually opening into a Kensho.
So this was when you were a Zen student, you came across that koan?
I did. It's not typically traditionally a koan, but it was a line out of the Diamond Sutra, and produce the thought that is nowhere supported.
Right.
That's it.
Right. Yeah, I guess that can happen with when people are speaking from this place, there can just be a transmission that happens in the language that's used, right? So everyday language can
Right.
become koan-like.
Very much so. You can see it in the koan structure. A lot of those are stories of the Chan teachers, masters of the 6th and 7th century in particular. It was a particularly sharp group during that period. Like any time in history, there's some folks who were really, everything is coming together, and just it's a kind of a perfect storm.
Right.
And so a lot of them are just the normal interactions with students that were recorded by other students that became our formal koan study.
Right. And maybe you could share a bit with the audience about the structure of that formal koan study, like the kind of Dharmakaya koans that it begins with, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And you're quite right. It begins with what we call the Dharmakaya koans, which are really the awakening koans. They're koans that open you to the absolute, which is what I call the source. And the first, all three koans are fairly famous. Mu is usually the first one undertakes or takes on. And the Mu koan, Master Joshu was walking with a student, and in my view, the student was having some self-doubt. Can I really achieve this? Am I too damaged, broken, too vulnerable, weak, whatever? And so they had a stray dog passed. And the student said to Joshu, does the dog have Buddha nature? I think, doing it one step away from him. And of course, the right answer that all Buddhists should say is yes, of course. All sentient beings have Buddha nature, the nature or the ability to be fully realized. And Joshu, to his credit, said Wu in Chinese, which is no, not, nothing, something like that. And of course, the student was completely flummoxed by this. And that became our important koan. Why did, in effect, Joshu say no or nothing when the answer is yes? And clearly he wasn't lying, so how does that reconcile? So that's usually the first koan one engages. And then there are two other Dharmakaya koans, original face koan, we call it, and that is, what was your original face before your parents were born? So, no place to grab onto that conceptually. I mean, there's just no handholds at all. And then the third is the sound of one hand clapping. We all know the sound of two hands clapping, but what's the sound of one hand clapping? And of course, I get people to come in on this one and they go,
Yeah.
it's like, no, it's this. So once one, and in our tradition, what I like is not only must one provide an answer, but they must also demonstrate. It's common for us to say to the student, okay, show me Mu. And we'll keep asking until we're satisfied the student has easy access to the answers. And then begins the formal koan study. We have a group called the miscellaneous koans, where there's approximately 200 koans that think of it as sort of like a finishing school where everybody's first awakening is incomplete. If you think of it as a circle, this would be perfect. Most first kenshos are something like this, where there's some aspect that's really open and super clean, And then there's the rest that's occluded or not yet uncontracted. And the miscellaneous koans help with that. And then we begin the collections. There's the Mumonkan, the Gateless Gate, the Blue Cliff Record, the Book of Equanimity, and there may be another one I'm forgetting. But one works through those, and then if one does Dharma transmission, then there's a whole another set of multi-year program where you work through some of the more advanced teachings and practices in the Zen tradition.
And with what is mu, like you mentioned, the translation could be something, some kind of negation, right? It could be nothing, no,
Right.
without, absence. And I feel like after awakening, I mean, again, I'm dangerous territory here trying to give a conceptual answer, which obviously isn't the point. But after awakening, I think his answer makes sense in the sense that even Buddha nature is empty. I mean, I guess I'm quite Nagarjuna informed, like in my thinking here, but it's like even emptiness, even Buddha nature and emptiness are empty. So it's everything is, there is no thing there, no objectifiable thing called Buddha nature.
Right.
It kind of
Right.
it totally makes sense. But to think those thoughts isn't the thing, isn't what the point of that koan is.
Well, and the old expression, we're throwing the monkey wrench into the machine. We're trying to cause the machine to seize. And eventually it does. We try, and I was trained as a lawyer, so you can imagine all the gyrations I could come up with before having to cut through that. But at some point it does. The machine seizes, and we step outside the normal conceptual analysis, and we have a direct experience of it in a way that's and the cool thing about koans is that they're, even though we allow sort of a small range of answers, it's very narrow. So essentially the answers are identical or very close to identical. Even now, after thousands of years, you and I are still coming up with the answers they came up with in 6th century China.
Right.
So it's mind-blowing to think, but we're tapping into something bigger. The absolute is providing the answer, not you and I.
Yeah, and I think with the awakening, the feeling that there's any distance between ancient China and now, like the nowness of whatever's,
Yeah.
it's an eternal now. So it feels totally, what was alive for them is alive for us in exactly the same way. So it doesn't.
Well, and more than that, they're actually alive today. So the Buddha's preaching right now, and our great-grandchildren are playing in the park.
Yeah. The you may be dropping some koans in this conversation by accident or on purpose. So then, along with the koan practice, well, actually, before we move on to Shikantaza, when someone practices with a koan, are they typically given one to work with? Do they kind of chew on it 24/7 and then come to a teacher? Like, how does it work on that practical level?
Yeah, typically, the way I do it, I don't require students to do koan practice. I leave it to where it's self-selecting. Normally, somebody will come to me and say, "I'm really interested in trying koans," or "I'd like to do koan practice." And so some of them, most will start with mu, but like I had one person who started with original face because that came up in their practice. They began asking about original face and having some insights. So I said, well, let's pick up that koan. Let's do that one first, because clearly it was arising. So some of that happens, but typically we follow the order of the koans, pretty typically. Anyway, I didn't know if there's more to your question.
No, that's great. And when it comes to advising students, given that you're informed on the kind of gradual Theravadan path and the Zen path, is there a way that you go about advising people on different paths? Is it quite one size fits all in terms of you mentioned everyone should maybe start with the concentration, then move on to the direct practices? Yeah, do you find there are different kinds of people who resonate with different approaches?
There are definitely people that have a karmic proclivity for one practice or one tradition over another. I'm finding, though, that when I am presenting the Theravadan, as you say, the gradual realization practices of samatha, I'm finding that those are having a deep impact on people. And the way I teach them is a little different. I teach them on a non-conceptual level. So in my teaching, it's let's first understand the concept, then we've got to drop beneath the concept to the felt sense of the practice. And that's where the work is happening rather than in the conceptual, we're balancing and bouncing ideas. It can be helpful, but we need to get beneath that. That's really the point. And that's part of what happens because our whole conceptual structure is also keyed into our identity. So as we begin to gradually break down the concepts, we're also slowly eroding the importance of the identity. So we begin to remove some of the underpinnings little by little. I think one of the fascinating things to me too is, this is true for me as well as students, with realizations, we actually end up rewriting our history because we're changing our identity. And so some of the stories, like say you had a story when you were 5, something traumatic happened and you had a whole life sequence following that, you might find through meditation that you misunderstood what happened. And by correcting the misunderstanding, it ends up changing that whole chain of I'm somebody who's lousy at math. All of a sudden, no, I wasn't lousy at math. I had a teacher who was having an emotional breakdown or having a personal problem. So, it's really fascinating how this works. Again, we're becoming deeper in contact with the absolute. At the same time, we're really upgrading. We're really making ourselves a kind of 2.0 of who we were.
Yeah, I love the way you describe that because I feel like we're really in the terrain now of what awakening is all about. That, the way that you think reality is just objective. You think, yeah, I was bad at math, like that, and that was who I was. That was my identity. And you don't even think in those terms. You just like that was a fact of existence. And then you see the way that actually there were concepts, beliefs that were reified, and that can dissolve, and suddenly reality is reconfiguring itself. And
Right.
And it's like actually that isn't what happened, and there is no correct view of anything. There is no
Right.
what has
It's all
happened.
right. Well, even now, you and I have a certain perspective on this, but we could also have different seats we could take, and we'd be viewing this very differently.
Right.
So that's absolutely right. And that's the cool thing about this is that as we're getting more and more in touch with the absolute, as we're becoming more of an agent of the absolute, let's say, then we're also putting down a lot of the what I call core convictions of how the world works. This is
Right.
me, I'm just being me. And it's like, well, me isn't a solid. Me is, it's like a stew that ingredients keep getting added to. So you're changing, it's changing. And that's the great thing about it. Again, the fluidity we get from that becomes really helpful.
Yeah, you mentioned the samatha practices. I don't know if you could explain to people a bit more about how you teach those.
Sure. Yeah. The samatha are one body of practice in Theravada Buddhism, and the overall umbrella is called purification of mind. So purification of mind means that we're refining the mind, we're refining identity, we're looking into all these things on a very gradual basis. We start with the breath awareness practice, which can lead to a level of concentration called absorption, which is a very, very deep concentration state, non-dual and no self. So there's no sense of a me, there's no thought, but you're completely merged in the meditative object. So it's very impactful. You can imagine, I call it the sheep dip. It's sort of like rather than getting a cup of water, we get bloop, we get completely submerged. So it's really quite impactful. And there are other practices too. There are what are called 32 body parts, where we go through identifying skin, hair, all these different parts of our body. And it sounds very rudimentary, but what's important here is if we drop beneath the conceptual on this, even something as basic as skin, you have identity in your skin. Not necessarily the color or the, how dry or smooth it is, but just this is me. And so part of what we're doing is we're dropping beneath the concept to where we're getting into the felt sense, where it starts getting beneath the identity. So it's one way we start, getting underneath and getting into the flow down there that's not fixed. It's more fluid. And there's things like following that skeleton meditation, you experience your whole body as a skeleton. On the retreat I did with my teacher, I had to do the advanced practice, which I had to see everybody else in the retreat as a skeleton. And so at one point, I was in the cafeteria or the dining room eating. I look around and it's all skeletons sitting there eating and chewing and swallowing. And it was just like, wow, this is really, really weird. The teacher would say, "Oh, you go do this," and I'm like, this is never going to happen. Yeah, I want you to go see everybody's a skeleton. Okay, sure, no problem. But I try. I figured, I don't know, I'll try. And there it is. I'm looking at all these skeletons, and it's like, wow, this is super trippy. And even things like I saw one person I knew well, and I could tell they had a break in like their arm or their leg. And after the retreat, I asked them, by the way, did you ever break your right arm? And they said, yeah, that when I was 6, I fell out of a tree and broke my arm. How'd you know? And I said, I was doing the practice and I could see the break in your arm. It was a different kind of coloration. So anyway, so whatever that means, I don't know, but
Yeah.
some of the stuff works that way.
Yeah, I can actually imagine a kind of a kind of explanation of that that fits with current understanding of science, but still retains the kind of, because in these states, I think you're really aligning with intuition, and I can imagine we have such good models of how people's bodies move that without even realizing it, you could pick up on like subtle, ways in which the body moves, and then kind of in like an imaginal way dramatize it. So it totally makes sense to me actually that, if scientists studied those kinds of phenomena, you may actually find, yep, that was you really detected something there, but in a
Yep.
way where it's due to the kind of incredible power of our organism to kind of simulate the world rather than needing to, oh, actually I got X-ray vision suddenly, or
Yep.
yeah,
Or we have a super normal power for a while.
yeah, it
Because
was,
in
yeah,
Buddhism
the
we
stuff that
have
may
we
not
have
be
the
known to science.
cities. Well, for example, we have the meditation for elements, earth, water, fire, and air, and we work with those again down to a non-conceptual level, and we break down the characteristics of each. And one of the outcomes can be that our body turns into this crystal body, and we look through the crystal body in a certain way, and we see our body as what I found as a pile of fireflies. And I found out those fireflies were called kalapas, which are basically subatomic particles. So at least the Buddhists have been meditating, making direct contact with subatomic particles for thousands of years. And science eventually caught up. But that always blows my mind too. How does that work?
Yeah, that's how it's taught on the Goenka retreats. They talk about the kalapas and that kind of, yeah, I've definitely had experiences that feel very aligned with the kind of, yeah, like quantum dynamics of just flickering potency with things collapsing into kind of a digital, yeah. So there's definitely, I mean, we are existence, so perhaps it's not surprising there's some resonance there. But I'd
Right.
love to talk to you
And I
about, yeah,
well, let me just throw one last thing in.
yeah,
And my newest book, Liberating the Self, I go through all the samatha practices about how they work. I talk about my experience with them. So if folks are interested in reading about those, that's
oh, great.
one. And I've got a book, Practicing the Jhānas, I co-authored about the actual jhana practice that folks can
That's
look
where I
at
was
if
going
they
to go
wish.
next, actually. Yeah,
Okay,
it's to say about jhanas, if you'd like to share.
sure. What would you like to know?
So yeah, I guess if you could just share with the audience, I guess why one might practice the jhanas, like how this path as a gradual path to awakening works compared to the more direct kind of Zen path.
Yeah, well, the breath awareness practice, jhana practice, and when I say jhana practice, there are a number of meditations that can open to jhana or absorption, which is the third level of concentration. The first is momentary, where is your awareness in this moment. The second is access concentration. There's some stability with the meditative object, and in absorption, there's a complete union, merger with the object. And again, as I mentioned, there's no sense of self and there's no thought. So it's quite dramatic to have that. And with the breath awareness jhanas, each jhana will have a kind of a radio frequency, like you're sitting in this field with this. I can't say noise exactly, but let's call it a noise. But there's this clear high pitched noise or something that feels like a high pitched noise. And when we first encounter it with first jhana, it's generally too much for people. So they end up leaving first jhana within a few minutes. And over time, we get to where our consciousness begins slowly to match the vibration. And when we get to where we can sit comfortably for an hour or more in first jhana at that frequency, then we're usually ready to approach second jhana, which has an even higher frequency. And one of the secrets of Buddhism is the more delicate, the more subtle something becomes, the more potent and powerful it is. So the more refined these jhanas get, they feel like they're very ephemeral, but they are, they're concentrated 1,000 to 1 or some huge proportion that is quite impactful.
Right. And with these practices, I guess I'm interested in the role of effort because, as I mentioned, my preference for the kind of direct path has been that I've kind of emphasized effortlessness when I talk about this stuff in terms of, you're not doing it, the absolute's already doing everything.
Right.
So kind of surrendering into that as you would with shikantaza, just sitting, not doing anything. But with jhana, I guess it's interesting because in the beginning with the concentration, there's usually some deliberate intention, effort applied. But then the point is the absorption kind of takes over and kind of, so it does have its own kind of effortless quality. So yeah, I wonder if you could, I've heard you speak about this in terms of proactive versus receptive effort, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, most of Theravada Buddhism is presented dualistically. So for even cessation, for example, the instruction would be, okay, James, I want you to take Nibbana as your object, as your meditative object. What? Where in the direct, we're not talking about it in that kind of dualistic way. And so most of the practices begin with a certain amount of me bringing some effort to the practice. I'm staying with this object intentionally. And I'm doing this as I have my normal thoughts, emotions, memories, future planning, whatever going on. And I'm training myself to come back again and again to the same object in Anapanasati, breath awareness to breath. And so I keep returning, and eventually it begins to stay on its own. And this is where the proactive effort shifts to receptive effort or receiving. And this is where it becomes the effortless effort you're talking about, where something is happening, but the practice is beginning to do you. And that's a shift that happens. And that's true of all practice. I mean, shikantaza, koan, same thing. We at first take it up, I have the koan mu. It's my koan. And after a while, there's just mu. And eventually it's, well, mu is doing me. I'm not even doing mu. So there is that progression that happens, as you say.
And I think when one kind of integrates this stuff, that quality of losing oneself into the, you could call it practice or just into the absolute, can actually be quite, I mean, maybe unsurprisingly, can be quite challenging to kind of let the sense of self fall apart and disintegrate and die. Yeah, I mean, actually, I won't, let's circle back to that later because I do want to talk about integration. But before we get there, on this issue of effortlessness or effort and effortlessness, the way I heard you talk about it before was to say that if you just to test where you're at on this proactive versus receptive effort is, you're doing the practice is to kind of relax slightly into effortlessness, and that will kind of test and see if that receptive effort is there and keeps the practice going. Is that like is the other option that you relax and then you just kind of become kind of zoned out, dull, the practice kind of stops?
Yeah. So there needs to be enough. Think of it this way: we want with the Anapanasati practice, breath awareness, we want to maintain awareness on the breath in the Anapana region. And so if you're sitting there meditating and you're thinking about you're going to go meet a friend for lunch, then clearly you're not doing the practice then. So it's going to require a little more proactive effort to come back to the breath. Because we choose each time. Whatever we're distracted by, we choose to come back. So a lot of that's developing the rigor. And to me, I think it's showing a certain amount of respect and devotion to the absolute. And this is just my orientation towards it. But at some point, it begins to stay. And that's where we have to have the sophistication to begin lessening our own personal effort. And we need to invite the effortlessness. We need to invite the absolute to take over the practice. And it's not like a light switch on or off. It's more like a dimmer switch where it's a gradual thing. And it's two steps forward, one step back sort of a process. But we keep testing it and we keep relaxing. If we're doing it correctly, we'll find this kind of tug deeper with a sense, I'm not doing this. I didn't make the practice go deeper. And if we do it too prematurely, then we'll find our awareness is now thinking about lunch again. We've lost the meditation entirely. So that's when we're too loose. We need a little more rigor, a little more proactive effort.
Yeah, I was teaching a workshop recently where I led one of these kind of more effortless oriented practices, and the way that I phrased it, instead of saying that each time we choose to come back, it was more I said that if we just commit for this time, we have the intention that once the noticing arises of being distracted, then the mind will just bring attention back, and we just commit once, and then we can surrender into the practice, let that kind of spirit of letting the practice do us. And it only lasted 25 minutes. It was the first practice of the day. But three people afterwards came up and said they had the same experience of a very dramatic kind of absorption to the point of fading of perception, of my voice being very kind of faint and far away. And I didn't have much time to talk to them about the nuances of it. And I wasn't sure if that was something where it's either working and they're getting super absorbed, or if maybe it's there needs to be more of a, I guess I would have asked if there was like clarity and a sense of aliveness and experience, to figure out that kind of dullness thing. Is it dullness or is it absorption?
Well, you might also ask them how much they're doing.
Right.
And that's another way to look at it. But typically that would be indicating they're at least mid access concentration, where the effortlessness, and also we're in the Buddha suttas, he talks about it as we're withdrawing from the sense doors. So that would be an occasion where, even in first jhana, if you were giving a talk, I'd be able to tell there's a human speaking in the room. I wouldn't be able to necessarily discern the words or the meaning, or if you rang a bell, I could hear it,
Right.
and all. But it would sound like it's a quarter mile away. So
Yeah.
it doesn't relate to me exactly. There's that kind of separation. But
Yeah.
that would be good access concentration in my mind.
Yeah, that's kind of what they said, is that they couldn't hear the words a lot of the time, even though it's a very small room. And so, yeah, okay, that's good to get feedback on how to adjust that, to fine tune that practice. Thank you. We mentioned shikantaza meditation as well, but we haven't kind of defined it, spoken about that. I wonder if you could speak on that.
Sure. The shikantaza I learned 50 years ago as a young Zen student. They spend a lot of emphasis on the physical posture of zazen, or Zen meditation. Your legs this way, your robes this way, your hands, your eyes, your all this, and nothing about the interior practice. And so I went around to some of the senior folks there, and one on one, and asked them, well, what are you doing in shikantaza? What's happening for you? And I basically got a different answer from every person I asked. And I realized that nobody knows what they're doing. They just sit, and then whatever happens, happens. And so when I began teaching shikantaza, I actually borrowed from the Chan tradition. And also this was influenced by the Anapanasati experiences I've had, that I could see that, in my view, the shikantaza evolved out of the jhana practice as it came from India to China. The teachers wanted to pull away from the students striving for jhana, and so they began softening the instructions and teaching to the point that they didn't have any instructions to give. And so I have three stages when I teach it. The first stage is unity of body and mind. Just what's your interiority? Are body and mind in a unity, or are they separate? Is this mind and this is body? Many people have a conceptual separation in the neck. So if they have a separation, you hold body, mind, and separation as one. And by maintaining awareness, the concept will begin to dissolve. And at some point, everybody has the unity. They feel the oneness. So holding that as inside or interior, we allow awareness to make contact with the exterior atmosphere. So we're trying to see, are the interior atmosphere and exterior atmosphere the same or different? Are they in harmony? For most people, when they start, they're not harmonious. There's a different vibration. But with paying attention, they begin to harmonize. And when they're harmonized, we begin to lose the body boundary. In my work, I believe the body boundary is one of the most core identities we have. I think we identify it when we're pre-verbal. You know, I'm hungry, I need a diaper change. You know, it's all happening in this body. And those folks out there, the caregivers, fix it. So that begins one identity. So that's what we're beginning to soften. And then I tell people when enough of the body boundary is missing, like I can't feel my head, my legs, or I have a body dysmorphia, I believe it's called. My leg feels like it's 2 meters over here and my arm a meter over there. And then that's stage two is the inner and outer unity. Stage three is opening to the vastness. So we're opening to the absolute. And that becomes just a resting, abiding in the absolute directly, which is really the intention of the practice in my view. So with having these stages, most of my students are able to routinely, successfully at home, rest in the absolute as their daily meditation. So I think it's really, to me, it's a lot more supportive for students. I don't think it gives them a lot more concept to get snagged on, but it does help people make direct contact. And let's
Right.
throw in one last thing.
Mhm.
One of the differences in my teaching too is I began doing what I call these guided meditations, where I just began describing what was in the field, what I was perceiving in our field. And it turns out that most people could feel what I was describing. They couldn't necessarily see what I was seeing, but it would create a resonance. And most of the students I have that have had Kensho have had it in the guided meditation. So it has an impact. And again, I tell people, I'm not doing anything. There's no technique that I know how to do. I'm just opening to the absolute and giving voice to the absolute. And I'm reporting what's here. That's it.
Yeah.
But that's another feature of my teaching that's unusual, but seems to be quite impactful for folks.
Yeah, the that really resonates. In my experience, the best guided kind of non-meditation, just sitting kind of practices also function as kinds of pointing out instructions where there's, as you mentioned, kind of resonance. And we're in very subtle terrain here because it comes down to kind of, okay, you're just sitting, you're not doing anything. Well, what counts as doing? You know, if you say to someone when you notice, when you notice you're lost in thought, you let go of that thought, is the letting go a doing or is the thinking a doing? And I would be inclined to say that the thinking is a doing and the letting. So if you gently invite someone to just let go, that's you can not trying to as you mentioned, like a loyally kind of taking an angle to get out of the non-doing. But I think there's a way to point to this where you can align people to a genuine non-doing. So in the sense of like, even asserting a labeling of inner and outer is a subtle doing. And
Yeah.
egoic kind of asserting oneself. So if you're there saying, okay, just sitting, but notice there are no labels on inner and outer. Sound, inner thoughts arise, outer sounds arise. You're kind of, it's like a kind of maneuvering someone into the right mental posture, you could say, for as you say, just kind of relaxing into the absolute. So yeah, I like the way that you're bringing together those things, because when you say there are 3 steps to non-meditation, that could sound kind of paradoxical of like,
Yeah.
now it sounds like we're doing something, but if it's done skillfully,
Yeah.
I think that could be wise.
Yeah, I think so. I think it really helps. I mean, we need to language some of this because we got to communicate. But like to me, one of the biggest instructions, most common instructions I give in the guided meditations is surrender.
Right.
Let go. Let go of your ideas, let go of identity, let go of your interpretation of what's happening. Just be here. Surrender, let go, be taken is really the kind of orientation we need to have.
Yeah, and I think as we spoke about at the beginning, the synthesis of the direct and the gradual, again, it seems to me there's nothing is lost and everything is gained by just infusing everything with this non-dual understanding, so that, because otherwise we pile on instruction after instruction and we'll do this, okay, put in more effort here, but there can also just be this reset of like, and also forget all that, just this. Just stop overcoming, just surrender, it's just this right now, absolute being the absolute. But not forget it as in like don't do it, but like take those as pointers and then don't let the mind get into this dualistic kind of reasserting
Right.
itself on its path.
Well, and also try not to claim ownership. You know, people do this, they'll have the experience, and okay, now I can put the merit badge on, I've had this experience or that experience. Yeah, but it's gone now. You know, what was the impact? That's what we care about. It's not that you had Kensho, it's like, where are you today?
And
So
the
it's,
claiming of it is the obscuration of it, the saying, I'm the ego who had
yeah.
a no self experience is the kind
And
of.
and we all do it, you know. And I tell people the first 20 years of my practice, I realized at the end of the 20 years, most of what I was doing was trying to get out of my own way.
Right,
So it's exactly what you're saying is stopping with the doing, stopping with the, I'm in charge of this practice. I know what to do. No,
right.
you don't.
Yeah, beginner's mind.
Right.
I wonder if you could speak to the Zen model of awakening.
Sure. And I write about this in my book, Demystifying Awakening. I've got both the Theravadan and the Zen maps. And the Zen map, as I present it, there's initial awakening that we call Kensho. Kensho is a more generic term for awakening. So one could rightfully say any awakening is Kensho. As I teach it, I have three components I'm looking for with an awakening experience. I'm looking for a deep absence of self, what we call traditionally no self experience. I'm looking also for a deep unity experience, a oneness. Everything is the same fabric of love, something like that. And then there has to be a third component of the recognition. This is my true identity. This is truly who I am. And not in the sense of me as the small me, but in terms of the universe. This is what everything is. So we can have the pieces. Like I had somebody on a retreat I just finished, a jhana retreat, who had a deep no self experience at the end of the retreat. And I told him that this isn't an awakening. I'm not confirming that. Very, very deep in the no self, but you didn't have much of the love there. It had a little bit of love, but it wasn't the dramatic love experience that we're looking for. So I said, this is a start, you know, so, but it suspended the sense of identity for a while. So that was useful for that person. So we need to have these pieces to it. And so that would be a first awakening in my teaching and presentation. And the effect of that would be, and also duration is based on how long the normal sense of self is suspended. So you self-reference and you say to me, I can't find James anywhere. You know, I don't know where he is. So it's something like that. The second level of realization that I use the term satori for, which is also a common term used for awakening, but to me the satori is deeper. Satori requires at least 50% of consciousness has to be involved in the awakening experience or more. And so what happens is there's a shift where the person with the Kensho still has the personality and that structuring as their base. The person with the Satori experience, now what I call true nature, which is the qualities of the absolute in an individual consciousness, that's the foundation. So that's a big shift away from the personality workings to now you're beginning to root in true nature. That's your reality. And then that leads to the third level of realization, which is fairly rare, called Daigo Tete, which literally translates as final or full enlightenment. And there's no such thing. But what happens is there's such a resolution and realization that the sense of self falls away and doesn't get reactivated. So there's no longer a sense of me at all for that individual. But along the way, with each of these realizations, there's personal work that has to be done. And I call it the stair-step method, where somebody will have, say, a significant Kensho, and following the Kensho, whatever in their personality structuring is incongruent with the realization is going to come up for work. So we've got to investigate that behaviors, that attitudes of mind to see if they're true or not. And I tell people you got to use the compass of truth. If it's not true, you have to discard. You can't keep what's false. And so little by little, you're letting go of all these patterns of me, and that prepares us for the next realization. But between the Satori and Daigo Tete, The main work is working this, what in psychology they call the core wound. And that's a real basic sense of failure, worthlessness, valuelessness that most people carry. And it's very, very challenging to work. It's very ingrained. We believe it very deeply. So it's very hard to conclude our work with it. And that's why I only know a few teachers that have experienced that. I've got 2 or 3 students working that territory right now. So I'm seeing it on the other side now too, helping guide them and support them through it. So that's basically the model, and that can be done. It can be done with koans, without koans. I think it's easier with the koans because the koans sort of chip away at the stalactites and stalagmites of our cave to the point we have this nice, open, spacious realization, and we need that. And also we become a stronger vessel to hold the truth of the absolute, so we can hold more of the absolute.
Right. And to tease out the subtleties of when you said about the Daigotete, there being no such thing as full enlightenment, would it be accurate to say that, in your view, that the self, that core woundedness can resolve, can come to an end, which is what the Daigotete is,
Yep.
but the refinement, integration, conditioning, the journey continues in some sense from a no self place?
Yeah, I think there continues to be work, and because we still have, our basement of unconscious and subconscious material is pretty full. So what happens is these things percolate up when they're ready to be resolved, or when we have a triggering event. You go into some ordinary situation and have this incredible overreaction. And that's mostly what I have students watch for after awakening is watch for your overreactions, your disproportionate reactions. That's indicating something is getting triggered on an identity level. And so that gives us our work. We can begin watching and seeing patterns. So it isn't like the person with a Daigotete realization that they're working this constantly, but it is going to get kicked up. So to hold a model that they're done and they're fully enlightened and all is really a disservice. We're all still working. We're all students all the time. There's no finish line, which is personally, I like there's no finish line. That means that I can just work exactly where I am. I don't need to get anywhere else,
Right.
but here.
Yeah, I think the way you're describing it is excellent in that, because there are multiple pitfalls people can fall into here. And the one is, as you're saying, fixating on a finishing line, ideas of perfection, just kind of, I think that whole idea of perfection, needs to be, if we accept everyone's
Discarded.
imperfection, exactly, that's crucial, I think. And we've seen what happens when people give teachers the permission to just be treated as perfect, no matter what they do. And
Right.
but at the same time, not fooling ourselves that that like the self can come to an end, that these milestones do exist, and so there's a way to not fall, not just be like, oh, it's all made up, it's not possible, no one's ever achieved anything, or I mean, no one has ever
Right.
achieved anything, but you know what I mean.
Well, we have a lot of people who will get attached to emptiness. Like I've heard teachers do this, say, well, one teacher, people were complaining about their brutality that I studied with many years ago. And the teacher was talking with me and said, I don't know what they're talking about. I don't feel a thing. And I said, well, if you're standing on my foot hurts.
Right.
I get that your foot doesn't hurt. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But really, your point is excellent that we're not orienting to perfection. I say this regularly to my students. We're orienting to authenticity.
Right.
Very different. Can you be real in this moment, as real as possible? That's the challenge. That's the Genjo Koan.
Right. Yeah, that's wonderful. And before we run out of time, I'd love to hear a comparison from the Zen model to, I point actually early in the conversation to cessation and its role in the Theravadan model. But I wonder if you could just quickly sketch that for people.
Yeah, and cessation is an experience. And to me, cessation is the core of the absolute. So it's like that still place in the middle of the tornado or the hurricane. We orient to cessation by making contact with the peace, stillness, and absence of the absolute. And imagine the peace and stillness are so potent that they absorb everything. So everything that comes close to that completely is absorbed and shuts down. All our mentality and materiality are gone. So it's like a dreamless sleep where it's lights out, and we only know we had it afterwards. When we awaken, there's an awakeness that's present. And what I found with students is it needs to be at least a 30-minute cessation experience to be significant enough to be an awakening. Less than that is potent, but after 30 minutes, it seems like something switches. And in the Zen tradition, working koans, I've been talking with other Zen teachers, and a number of the teachers are familiar with cessation, but very briefly. Meaning when they conclude certain koans, there will be sort of a short stay in cessation, but it's really a matter of a few minutes or something very brief. It's not sustained the way the Theravadan view it. So that's a little different orientation. I really would prefer for my students to have both the Zen awakenings and the Theravada cessation awakening. I think they do different things. I think they both are very important. And I do have students who have had both. So I can see the difference. They're just more balanced in some way.
Could you speak more to that? You said they do different things.
Well, the cessation being a lights out experience, everything, consciousness and awareness shut down. So there's something about being in that primordial space of absence, so emptiness, there's nothing, of deep peace, a peace that everything smooths and surrenders to. And then the stillness that is so profound, we can actually have a ringing in our ears when we encounter this stillness. It's so significant. So all of that, so to steep in that, have your consciousness just steeped in that in this incredible way is just purifying in a very dramatic way. I can see why in Hinduism and in the yogic tradition, as well as in Theravada Buddhism, why it's been such a hallmark of an experience, because it is that big of a deal to do. When I do retreats, I can guide people, those who are open, I can guide them to what I call the cessation waiting room. So they can get close enough where they can feel the pull of cessation, like a tractor beam on a science fiction movie. They can feel that pulling start, but they're just not able to say yes completely. And that's what it requires. That's the entry when we get close, is we have to say yes on some level that's thoroughgoing.
Right.
And most of us are reluctant for a very long time.
Yeah, I can imagine with the Zen, the kind of Kensho awakening, there can be a tuning into fullness that wouldn't do the same thing as that, wouldn't be the same thing as a total willingness to disappear into absolute voidness, the kind of level of non-attachment, surrender, saying yes to the absolute in its most confronting form, I guess, in the absence, the kind of non-beingness form rather than the beingness.
And part of the resistance, is because we all understand I can say yes and this will happen, and all of us get, I don't know how to exit this. I don't know how to end it.
Right.
And so there's the possibility the survival instinct gets activated, which is the big resistance. And it's going like, you may die. Do you get that? You're taking us somewhere, you may die. And you have to say, okay, that may be the price of this ride, and I'm willing to pay it.
Yeah, the matter of birth and death, right? Is it Dogen who said that? That's what it's all about.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Stephen. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, great being with you. One thing I'd like to just mention, I have a video series coming out called Anatomy of Awakening, which should be out any day. And it's a series of interviews my Zen teacher, Sandra Roshi, and I did of about 10 other teachers, non-dual and Buddhist teachers, on the topic of awakening, how they work with students, what resistances they see, how they support it, what the role of therapy is, all these different things. And it was really fascinating to do that, because not everybody's the same. I mean, I was interviewed too. My teacher interviewed me and I interviewed him. all of us have different styles of approaching this, but it was really fascinating to see the commonality and how awakening is really becoming rooted in the West in its own way. So
Yeah, I
that'll be
was.
out and that'll be for sale, and that's a fundraiser, or I'm hoping to buy a retreat house or center in the next couple of years.
That's great. I'll put a link in the description. Yeah, I was just checking that out and saw that you have Rick Hansen and Locke Kelly, who are both previous podcast guests. Michael Taft, you've got some great people
Yeah.
on that. Is there anywhere else you would point people to? You've got a lot of books.
Yeah, on
Anywhere else?
Amazon I've got books. I've got the Jhānas book. I've got Buddhist Heart, which is the heart practices. Trust and Awakening, which I retranslated the first poem of Chan, the Xing Xing Ming, and have some commentary. Demystifying Awakening, I just mentioned the Theravadan and Zen path. And the newest book, Liberating the Self. And one of the features I like best about that book is I've got about 10 awakening stories in there from students who have had awakenings in the last couple of years. So these are modern students, not ancient folks. And to see it being so relevant and impactful, people have found it really inspiring to read. And because I wanted folks to know this is real and it's happening to people just like you every day. So don't view it as it's not possible for me and it's some fairyland. That's not the case.
Yeah, it's crazy how many people these things happening to, and you just don't, unless you pay attention, you just don't hear about it. Like the mainstream culture just doesn't talk about it. It's kind of
Well, and
crazy.
how would they? How would they
Right,
talk
right,
about
right, right.
this? You talk to somebody, well, James, you're not going to know who you are,
Yeah,
and you're
yeah,
not going to be able to relate to anybody for a while. Yeah,
yeah,
sign me up for that.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
But it's the freedom and liberation we don't know about that we get.
Right.
You know about this.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Stephen. Really enjoyed this.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Really nice meeting with you and spending this time together, James. Be well.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.